Hi, everyone. So this week we're going to be reading chapter 14 about non-experimental design, and this will close us out in our study of quantitative design. So we've done experimental designs in chapter 12, we've done quasi-experimental in chapter 13, and then now chapter 14 covers non-experimental design. So as you're reading, you'll see many of the same things come up. So hopefully you'll start to get a more firm sense of the different types of design. So I have this triple Venn diagram here to sort of compare and contrast the different iterations of quantitative design that we are covering in this course. So the first one, experimental design. And experimental design is the only design that you can use to show causation. Now, we are going to be reading about non-experimental design this week, and you can have evidence of causality, and so you will get into that in this chapter. Now, we also read about quasi-experimental design. Now, the main thing that is similar about experimental design and quasi-experimental design is that there is some type of manipulation of the independent variable. So the independent variable is some type of intervention or something that the researchers can control, meaning that one group will get that intervention and the other group won't. So anytime you have a quantitative study where you are evaluating the effectiveness of a particular curriculum, of a particular intervention, of a particular pedagogy, anytime you are measuring that of some type of intervention and one group gets in and then the other doesn't, that's called manipulation, when the researchers are able to give it to one group and not the other. Now, in non-experimental, there is no manipulation of the independent variable. So this is kind of like the Pokemon example that we watched a few weeks ago, where they couldn't at birth say, okay, these kids are going to play Pokemon and these kids are not. They have to use existing data. So with non-experimental design, due to ethical reasons or the nature of whatever the variables are, the researchers are not able to manipulate it. So non-experimental design involves independent variables that are static, meaning that the researchers can't really control them. Things like sex assigned at birth, things like personality traits like extroversion, introversion. And this is where you are going to be reading about how to operationalize variables such as motivation. Those surveys that we read about in chapter 8, selecting surveys for things like motivation, things like even creativity, things like engagement, ways that you can quantify those. Those are things that you can't really control. Although engagement would probably be a better dependent variable, but perhaps in a non-experimental study, you might have something like that. So in non-experimental design, they have to make the groups based on either the presence or absence of that independent variable as opposed to manipulating it and giving it to the group. So that is the main similarity between experimental and quasi-experimental, is the ability to manipulate the independent variable. And then in non-experimental design, there is no manipulation of the independent variable. When they select participants, they have to select them based on whether or not they have the independent variable or not. And there's a lot of examples in chapter 14 in the text, so you can see what that will look like. Now, one similarity between non-experimental design and quasi-experimental design is there's no random assignment of the groups. And so we talked about that when we went over chapter 13 about, again, due to either logistics or ethical reasons, sometimes it's not possible for researchers to randomly assign participants to either the experimental group or the control group. Things like if students are already in an existing program or classroom, they're likely not going to move them randomly, but instead they are going to give one classroom the independent variable and the other the not. Now, in non-experimental design, you're not going to be giving one classroom the design because you're looking at more static traits like birth assigned at sex, gender, age, even things like motivation, things like their interest in a particular subject. That's another example in the text. Now, in both non-experimental design and quasi-experimental design, it's very important that researchers, when planning their studies, that they think about the potential extraneous variables and that they control for confounding variables. So as you're reading chapter 14, you will see many of the same methods for controlling for confounding variables as we read about in chapter 13 with quasi-experimental. Things like matching, things like using statistical means of leveling the groups, things like excluding everyone except those who have the extraneous variable. So you will see some of those. And again, hopefully that repetition will help you understand some of the methods that researchers use to control for confounding variables. And so the chapter 14 also does a good job thinking about how non-experimental design can pose evidence of causality, and then also with experimental design as well. So I created this. I know it's a little busy, but I kind of like it. So put in the chat what you think is maybe missing here, or what you would change, or the parts that you think are most important. And we can kind of make this a collective visual, and I'll go ahead and add to it or subtract based on what you think makes sense, based on what we know about quantitative design. And again, quantitative design is when you have numerical data and you perform statistical analyses to find, is there a relationship between these variables or not? And so in the coming weeks, we will go in, well, actually next week, we will go into the different methods of data analysis for quantitative design, the methods that researchers use to find out, is there correlation? Is there evidence that the independent variable does impact the dependent variable? Now, another key thing that comes up in chapter 14 that I think is going to be really helpful when you are doing your article critiques, because all of our article critiques are quantitative, so you can use these chapters as reference points, is the different design types. So cross-sectional design means that the data are collected at one point in time. Then longitudinal is when they are collected over a long sense of time, like typically a year or even more for longitudinal design. And then retrospective, meaning the data are collected on previous data, such as things that have happened to the participant in the past. And then also another thing that I thought was really helpful about chapter 14 is the different purposes in non-experimental design. So descriptive, predictive, explanatory. So this is helpful for you to think both when you're planning out your research proposal, and then also when you're evaluating the quantitative article that you chose for your article critique. What is the researcher's purpose? And if it's not clearly stated, you should be able to get a good sense of that from the introduction of their article, and then again in the conclusion when they come back and discuss their findings. So descriptive research, providing an accurate description of some type of situation. Predictive, wanting to be able to predict future outcomes, things like how does GPA impact college performance? And then explanatory, testing hypotheses and theories to explain why a phenomenon that we see operates the way it does or functions the way it does. And of course, so if you have any examples in the chat, please list those of different applications of quantitative design. It could be non-experimental, or it could be experimental, or even quasi-experimental with these same purposes, like descriptive, predictive, explanatory. Are there any research questions in education related to these three aims that you are interested in? Okay, so now that we have covered the three different designs, overarching designs for experimental, quasi-experimental, and non-experimental, I want to give you an example of each. So for an example for experimental design, this is an article for EEPA, Educational Evaluation and Policy Analysis, and it's looking at the effects of a summer mathematics intervention. And it says a randomized experiment. So as we know, experimental design, it has random assignment. That is what differentiates it from other types of designs like quasi-experimental design. So in this study, it was again measuring a summer program. So they had N means the number of participants. And so that's something that you should be looking for in your article critique, and that you should also include in your research proposal. How many participants would you like to have enrolled? So there were 263 third through ninth grade students who were included in the study. So and then the students were randomly assigned. So that's how you know it is experimental design. So one group got the mathematics program plus a free laptop. So they got the mathematics intervention program plus a laptop to take home, and then the control group. And then they found that in the end, when they did their measure, when they assessed the children's mathematics abilities at the end of the summer intervention program, they did find a statistically significant difference between the students who received the intervention and the computer as compared to the children in the control group. Okay, so for quasi-experimental design, this was a study where they were teaching the teachers a strategy called visual performance feedback, where they would use specific praise for students who had exhibited a need for behavior interventions. So this was a quasi-experimental design because the participants were not randomly assigned. And this study had a smaller sample size. There were 3 students and 3 of their teachers that were included in this design. And this study used systematic observation. So the intervention or the independent variable that they were measuring was this visual performance feedback model, and then also giving teachers coaching and consultation in how to use the strategy. And so they gave the teachers this training over time and the consultation. And then the researchers went into the classroom and they used a timed observation protocol. So every 10 minutes, they were marking down the number of times the teachers offer praise to those specific students, and then the different type of praise, whether or not it was about the behavior. And then they did notice that this intervention, the VPR model, along with the consultation, did make a difference on the teacher's use of the practice. And then for non-experimental design, this was an article about the achievement gap. And this article looked at the academic achievement of students from different racial groups and who were English language learners. So they, of course, since being an English language learner, you can't assign someone to that group. That's an existing data. So that's what makes this non-experimental, because of course participants are not randomly assigned to that. There would be no way to at birth assign a baby to the language that they are going to speak. And then also you can't really, there was no intervention provided. They were simply looking at the relationship between race and English language learner status and their outcomes on academic achievement. And so in this study, they looked at Black English language learners, white English language learners, Asian English language learners, and Latino English language learners. And they found that Black English language learners outperformed English language learners of other races. So a couple other notes about this study. This study would be an example of orientational research. So as you can see in the title, so they're trying to give a counter example to a lot of the research about the racial achievement gap. And so you can see here, and they had 198 participants in a large school district. So this is something else that you're going to be doing in your research proposal, is describing the research setting. So you can see an example of that here, a large school district in the Mid-Atlantic region of the United States. And so here you can see the statistics that they use. We're going to get into that next week, the different descriptive and inferential statistics that researchers use to evaluate quantitative design. Okay, so that was an overview of the different types of designs that we have went through. And in chapter 14, you are going to be focusing on non-experimental research, and you can still feel free to ask questions about experimental design, quasi-experimental design, and then the more specific research designs within those as mentioned in the text. So look forward to seeing your comments and talk to you soon.